Hi, thanks for watching. I want to talk today about something that may sound a little uninteresting to you at first, but I hope that you get locked in. A naturalist naturalism's a worldview that says that nothing exists except nature. Well said. And if nothing exists except nature, then of course everything has to happen naturally. Naturally so. My problem with that, my own doubts about that is, if naturalism is true, how would we know that it's true if everything happens according to nature? Well, there is an argument. My first step in that is that there is a formal argument called the argument against naturalism from reason, or the argument from reason. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that that's a reasonable argument. What it means is that there's an argument from the existence of reason. In other words, if reason is true, if reason really exists, logic would be another way to say it, if the rules of logic are true, then naturalism can't be true. And that's the argument that I want to make today. Let me start out with a quote from an atheist. Thomas Nagel he's an older guy now, but he's an atheist, well-known, teaches at a university, has written several books, and his last book is called this, Mind and Cosmos. And then the subtitle is this, Why Neo-Darwinism is Almost Certainly False. Now, what Thomas Nagel means by Neo-Darwinism is that everything happens naturally, according to the evolution, Darwinian evolution. You just take Darwin's theory of evolution, that life evolved from simple to complex. You just take that and apply it to everything. The beginning of the universe, the beginning of life, our human condition. You just apply evolution to everything. That's Neo-Darwinism. Well, this is a quote from his book. He says, he asked the question, is the evolutionary hypothesis really compatible with the continued confidence in reason as a source of knowledge? And his answer to that question is no. What he's saying is that naturalism is incompatible with reason. Well, that's very interesting, especially given that all of the leading atheists today, atheism is just the God answer of naturalism. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'd say things sometimes that pop in my head, but not necessarily yours. What I mean by that is that atheism answers the question, does God exist? And of course the answer is no, there is no God. That's atheism. No God, atheism. But that's just the answer to the question, is there a God? And if nothing exists except the natural universe and matter, matter's all that exists, so everything happens according to natural laws, nature's all there is, well, of course, then the answer to the question of God is there is no God. That's atheism. So they're two sides of the same coin, but they go together. And in my view, atheism is not the real problem because it's the answer to the question. Naturalism is the real problem because it's a false worldview that leads to that answer of atheism. So I guess I could say, to be on the attack, so to speak, hopefully with gentleness and respect for those people who disagree with me, I just want to ask questions like that. If naturalism is true, then there is no God. But if naturalism is true, could we even know that? And I think the answer is no, despite the fact that most all of the leading atheists, the ones that are prolific and the ones who want to be heard publicly, and fine, I do too. But their answer is they're the sort of like, we're the ones who are reaching our conclusions by the process of rational thinking, whereas religion is just blind faith. Well, I disagree with that, of course, and that's what I want to show in this program. Stay with me. Thomas Nagel's doubts about the explanatory power of naturalism were shared by none other than Charles Darwin. Let me read you a quote from him. He said, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value at all or trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions of such a mind? He had the same doubt. Unfortunately, I don't think he chased that doubt to its logical conclusion. So, for my way of thinking, what I want to try to show on this program is that the beginning of the emptiness of naturalism's explanatory abilities is in the idea of explanation itself. C.S. Lewis said it this way, that naturalism explains away explanation itself, in the sense that it reduces the idea of explaining something by means of logic and reason. It reduces that to absurdity. In other words, it can't happen. To give it a pictorial way, here's what I think. It seems to me that the worldview of naturalism cuts the branch off on which it is sitting. So if it's going to say we've reached the conclusion that nothing exists except matter, and we've reached that conclusion by means of reason and logic and evidence and very clear thinking, their conclusions eliminate the possibility of reason and logic and really clear thinking, because everything has to be explained in terms of nature, in terms of natural law. Again, I just want to explain the difference here a little bit between materialism, naturalism, and atheism, because I don't want you to miss that part, and I'll try to do it very simply and shortly. So the idea of materialism is just what exists. What is there in existence? What's real? And the materialist would say nothing exists except matter. It is comprised of atoms and molecules, and of course quarks, I guess now, would be a part of it, whatever they are. And that's it. There's nothing else. So keep that in mind. You can't go anywhere else. There's nothing else to look at. There's nothing else. If it doesn't get weight, if it doesn't have weight and take up space, it doesn't exist, because that's what matter does. Naturalism, then, is the process by which matter behaves, is kind of a loose word there, a little bit out of theme, but the way matter reacts, the way it just, naturalism describes mathematically the laws by which matter operates, by which it behaves. Atheism is simply the answer to the question, if naturalism is true and materialism is true, that's all there is, so there is no God. Well, that's atheism. So that's kind of down on the list here for me, and especially this program. So what I want to talk about here is very simply, really, is the argument against naturalism from reason, from the existence of reason and logic. Point number one. It's just a 3-point argument, and it's pretty simple once you get involved in it. Point number one: if every thought that I have and you have, if every thought can be fully explained by purely natural processes, then no thought is valid. Let me say it again. If every thought, and I'll use myself, if every thought that I have is fully explained by purely natural processes, then no thought is valid. I'll give you a really concrete example. Years ago, kind of after I started this ministry, I ended up doing a series of speaking engagements at Unitarian Universalist fellowships. And to give them credit, they were very gracious about having me come present the case for Christianity. And they did that based on their exaltation of tolerance and reason. That's what they're all about: tolerance, reason, freedom, truth. Great. So I'm about all those things. And so they said, if we're going to really be tolerant, we need to tolerate this Christian. And so they tolerated me. And I got the benefit of that by going to speak at their church. And they even paid me, I think. So they were really tolerant. But anyway, I remember going to a town in Georgia, and I can't remember the name of the town, that had a pretty good-sized Unitarian fellowship there. And I stayed with a family. I got there on Saturday, was to speak on Sunday. The first thing that happened was when I walked in and got my room and put my luggage in the room, the host came and gave me I'm pretty sure it was a Time magazine, and on the front of the magazine it said, "The Religious Gene." Well, what the article was about was they were looking for, and maybe they had found it or thought they found it, the idea that if a person is religious in their beliefs, it's because they are genetically wired that way. In other words, they have no free will in the matter. They haven't arrived at that decision by any kind of means other than their genetics. Nobody can beat their genetics, you know. I mean, genetically, I'm not very fast and I can't jump very high. It's hard to change that, you know. I can get a trampoline, but still I'm fighting against the genetics. Well, if that's true about religion, then people are religious not because of rational belief, not because of a reasoning process, but because they're wired by their genetics that way. Well, I have no control over that. I have no access to that. I suppose I could be genetically altered in these days of modern technology to be an atheist by that term. But the problem is, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If I'm wired by my genetics to be religious, then my religion has no relationship to what is true, what is not true, or reasoning, or evidence, or anything like that. It's just that's the way I'm wired. Well, then the same thing would be true about an atheist. If all of our beliefs can be explained by genetics and wiring, genetic wiring, which is a natural process, then that's the point. Then no thought is valid. Now, when I say valid, I need to explain to you what I mean by that. I mean justified. Philosophers call it justified belief or warranted belief. Something that we believe that is justified according to the laws of reason or the rules of logic. And that sounds like, well, it's getting out there now, but it's really not. We use these rules every day of your life. I promise you, you do. I'm going to tell you what the rules are real quickly, and then I'm going to give you a quick example of how you use it every day, and you don't think about it. I don't either. Rule number one is called the rule of non-contradiction. It's just a rule of logic. Here's the rule. Two truth claims cannot both be true at the same time in the same way. A cannot equal not A. It's that simple. Now, you say, it's kind of over my head. No, it's not. You use it every day. Somebody says, it's cold outside, and you say, no, it's not. You've just used the rule of non-contradiction. Now, I know there's a little bit of relativity there with cold and hot. But if somebody says, John's not here, and you say, yes, he is, you've just used the rule of non-contradiction. He can't both be there and not be there, unless you're talking about mentally and physically. And being a school teacher, I can readily assure you that's possible. But I hope you get what I mean. That's just a simple law of logic, the law of non-contradiction. The second law is the law of identity, which simply says A is A. If I come to your door and you say, hi, who are you? And I say, Dan Arsenault. And every single part of my identity is equal to the identity of Dan Arsenault, then I'm Dan Arsenault. If there's something different, then I may have a lot of similar characteristics to Dan Arsenault, but I could not be Dan Arsenault unless I match in every way his identity. We use that all the time too. Yes, you are. No, you're not. Yes, you are. No, you're not. That's the law of identity. And then the third law is very simple also. It's called the law of the excluded middle, which means that a proposition that is true cannot also be false. And that's all it means. It has to be one or the other. You might be interested in this, and I'll feel compelled to throw it in. We're talking about what sometimes is called the difference between Western logic and Eastern logic. If you are a pantheist, let's say a Hindu, you might think that this idea of either or, it's either this or that, but it can't be both. You might think, maybe that's not so true. And you'll hear things from Hindus and Buddhists something like it is and it isn't at the same time. That's a shovel, and it's not a shovel. And John has a shovel, and John has no shovel, and those are both equally true. The problem is it's not equally true. And you can call it Western or Eastern, or however you want to delineate it, and meaning no disrespect at all. But there's really no such thing as Western and Eastern logic. Truth is truth, reality is reality. And even in India, they look both ways before they cross the street. It's not the bus and no bus is coming. It's either the bus is coming or it's not coming. And if you ignore that law of logic and walk out in the street when the bus is coming, you suffer the consequences. So logic is inescapable. So these are the laws of logic, the rules of reason, by which if we reach our conclusions in accordance with those laws, then they are said to be valid conclusions. But here's the point. If my thoughts and my conclusions must be explained, not only that they can be explained by natural processes, they have to be explained totally by natural processes which are blind and irrational in themselves. And if that's the case, then I don't see how you can possibly say that the thought is valid. You could make the argument that thought is true. I mean, if I look out and see the car coming and I reach the conclusion the car is not coming, then I might not survive. But even then, it would be like everything else that happens, a matter of luck, a matter of chance. And it's also obvious that people can have very different conclusions and survive very well, especially if those conclusions aren't about their survival or their reproduction or gathering food or fighting their enemies, those things that are necessary for survival. Here's my larger point to lead into the second premise here. Logic and reason often don't happen. I mean, everybody that says that's not reasonable is accusing somebody of not being reasonable. We don't talk like that about natural laws. We don't accuse somebody of not obeying the law of gravity. It's because the truth is they can't not obey the law of gravity, and they're not really obeying it. It's just the way things happen. Obedience doesn't enter into it. So, in the same way that morality is not a natural law, morality are the rules of what should happen, and very often don't happen. They're an ought. Well, in the sense of the pursuit of truth, the rules of logic and reason are inherent. We hold these truths to be self-evident, but they don't often happen. Often people are irrational. So, again, just to kind of reiterate that, if every thought has to be explained in terms of blind natural processes, then no thought can be said to be valid. Then the second premise is this. If no thought is valid, then the thought naturalism is true is not valid. Now, I hope that my end purpose here is to use reason as an argument against the truth of naturalism. And I'm not trying to prove that naturalism is not valid, other than in the sense of saying if it's true, it's not valid. If it's true, it's false. Or it's not valid anyway. If it's true, we couldn't know it. Let's put it that way. Especially we couldn't know it through the blind process of non-reason and irrationality and blind luck. So the only way to show that naturalism is true is to form an argument apart from the laws of nature, not based on the law of gravity or physics or biology. That's not how you form an argument. You form an argument based upon the laws of reason or the rules of logic, the rules of inference, which is what evidence is all about. By the way, that's what science is all about. My bigger point here would be that if naturalism is true, you can't do science. Whoa, that's a scary thought. So the only way to show that something is true, including naturalism, is to form an argument apart from the laws of nature. You can use evidence, to be sure, that involve the laws of nature, but the laws of nature act randomly without thought at all. They're not rational thoughts. There's no decision being made. There's no conclusions being drawn. But the naturalist doesn't have that option because it's not included in his worldview. It doesn't fit in his worldview. Because on his worldview, as we explained earlier, nothing exists except matter and the natural laws by which matter behaves. If you drop the rock, it falls. It's not deciding to fall. It's not reasoning to fall. It just falls. Well, if matter's all there is and nature's the only way things happen, then that's that. You can't explain it any other way. The best picture, again, is a picture of a person sitting on a tree, on a branch on a tree, and as he's arguing for the branch's ability to hold him up, he's sawing it off. Well, eventually the branch will fall and his argument will not hold up. That's why we say the thought naturalism is true cannot be a valid thought if naturalism is true, nor could we know it. So according to naturalism, our thoughts, my thoughts, your thoughts, all God's children's thoughts, are the result of random mutations and natural selection, because that's the only way anything happens regarding life, of course. And look, here's another thing. I object to the term natural selection because nature doesn't select anything. Nature doesn't have a mind to make a selection. I might be more comfortable with the term natural rejection in that if you mutate wrongly or incorrectly, you will die. And so you've been rejected by your environment, so to speak. But I don't think, there's nobody behind natural selection going, I like that, I don't like that, I like that, I don't like that. We use those terms because we are reasoning. We select, and we can't speak in any other way. Even atheists and naturalists and materialists talk as if nature had a brain. Natural selection. Nature selects this, it selects that, and even talk about genetics being designed. This is, your eyes are for seeing, and your feet are for walking, and your ears are for hearing. No, if naturalism is true, my eyes are not for seeing, because there's no plan, there's no purpose behind that. They just happen to see. And of course that helps me survive better, and I pass on those genetics to my children, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I hope you get that second point. If no thought is valid, then the thought naturalism is true is not valid. I guess I need to add this before we move to the last point. At best, we could rely on our thoughts to help us find food and mates. And beyond that, think about it. People can believe all kinds of different things and still survive just fine. If those things have to do with God, people survive obviously with a lot of different ideas about God. Look at all the diversity of opinions and ideas in the world, and people survive just fine. But if those thoughts are a product of their genetics, it doesn't make any difference. Truth is not the object of nature. Let me say that again. Finding truth is not the object or purpose of nature. Survival is. The third and final premise or conclusion. Point number one, any thought that can be explained fully by natural blind processes cannot be considered a valid thought. If no thought can be considered valid because it's just a product of nature, then the thought naturalism is true cannot be valid. Finally, any thought that by its own conclusions invalidates itself ought not to be accepted, and its converse ought to be accepted. Now, if naturalism is not true, if naturalism cannot be the case, which I'm convinced that it cannot be the case, what's the alternative then? Well, quite simply, supernaturalism. If naturalism is not on all there is, then something exists that is outside of nature. Well, there you go. For me, it's just almost I don't want to say a no-brainer. That sounds like naturalism. But we call them no-brainers when it doesn't require a whole lot of thinking, that the best explanation for the existence of the universe is not nature itself. The universe can't create itself. The best explanation for morality is not survival, because then you've changed the subject. You're not talking about morality anymore. So if you reject naturalism because it just simply can't explain everything, and we'll get into that later in other programs, but then the only alternative is some kind of supernaturalism. Supernaturalism doesn't mean ghosts and goblins and witches, or even necessarily God, but it just means something metaphysical, something not natural has to exist. Even if it's the laws of reason and logic, the rules of reason and logic, the concepts, the music that plays on the CD is not natural. It's communicated through the natural world, to be sure, in the same way that I'm speaking to you now and my thoughts are being communicated to you, but my thoughts don't carry weight, nor do they take up space. The content of my thoughts are metaphysical or supernatural. So it's not like the scariest word in the world. So my point finally is this: the new atheists have branded themselves as the party of reason. Richard Dawkins established the Foundation for Reason and Science. Sam Harris founded Project Reason. The Council for Secular Humanism publishes a magazine called Free Inquiry, celebrating reason and humanity. The American Atheist Society defines atheism as the mental attitude which unreservedly accepts the supremacy of reason. And in 2012, all these people got together in Washington, D.C. and had a rally for reason. You guessed it. What's ironic is that despite all these rallies, atheists now are claiming that atheism is not really a belief at all. So you have all these organizations and newspapers and rallies in the name of a non-belief, I guess. It's very simple. It's not reasonable to think naturalism is true. If that's the case, then it's reasonable to think that there's something beyond the natural world. There's a reason for us to be here in the first place. Thanks for watching.